people think anymore? Do you care? Do you wonder what I think about you when you encounter people?
I wonder if people would care about my experience beyond whether or not they think I'm guilty or innocent.
Hollywood has for a long time hidden behind the safety of this like veil of fictionalization, while at the same time being able to exploit real people's stories and point to those real people's stories in order to sell their product.
I'm definitely not going back willingly. They'll have to catch me and pull me back, kicking and screaming, into a prison that I don't deserve to be in. People ask me questions like, well, what about your behavior outside of the house the morning that you were discovered? Like, don't you think that they were justified in suspecting you? And it's like, no, I don't. I really don't.
Okay, I'm reading from page 279 from Joh Follain's book, A Death in Italy. Robin was called first. Sitting at a wooden desk on the raised platform a couple of yards from Judge Massey, this is obviously in the courtroom, this is in February 2009, Robin read the oath each witness had to take. Then in a quiet, forceful tone, she spoke of her friendship with Meredith, her friend's criticisms, in other words, Meredith's criticisms of Amanda's exuberant character and her failure to keep the bathroom clean, and Amanda's coldness after the murder. Jurors listened almost open-mouthed as Robin recalled Meredith's surprise at seeing Amanda leave her beauty case in the bathroom with a vibrator and condoms clearly visible, just after her arrival in the flat. Meredith said it was quite strange to leave these there where they could be seen. She found it uncomfortable. That's according to Robin. Dressed in jeans and a green woolen sweater, Amanda sat still as she stared fixedly at Robin, her lips pressed tightly shut. Now, if you could get into Amanda's mind, if you were one of the journalists there, if you were sitting in court at that time, by the way, these are my words, what do you think you would think Amanda was thinking of Robin? Was Amanda thinking friendly thoughts about Robin? Did Amanda think well of Robin, and vice versa? Do you think Robin had positive thoughts about Amanda? Do you think Robin thought well of Amanda? And remember, Robin is Meredith's friend. Meredith is Robin's friend. Is Amanda Meredith's friend? What would Robin say about that? Is Amanda Robin's friend? What would Meredith say about that? Going back to the narrative, when Robin described the last time she had seen Meredith at the dinner in her flat on the night of the murder, Amanda looked across at Raffaele, smiled, and appeared to silently mouth the words "Cepale," which translates to "what a pain in the arse" at him. Now, it's possible Follain misinterpreted this, misconstrued it, but certainly that is what it appeared to him, that while this testimony was given, Amanda looks at Raphael, smiles, and mouths something to him. Now you might say, well, maybe it was something else. Well, what if it was Cepale? What a pain in the arse. And what is she talking about here? Who is the pain in the arse? Is it Robin? Is it Meredith? Is it both of them? Is it this whole deal being a pain in the arse? And what is really interesting is that if this is true, that Raffaele is in total agreement with it, that he understands what Amanda's talking about. And what's also incredible is that she does this in the context of a courtroom with all of these reporters observing. Raffaele, who had been swinging slightly in his swivel armchair from side to side, grinned back at her. During the rest of Robin's testimony, Amanda glanced twice more at Raffaele, smiling at him and shrugging her shoulders.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic shoes in true crime. By the way, these shoes have walked the streets of Rome and Perugia and throughout Italy. Now, I don't really rate Follain's narrative for taking any sort of position on the Knox case, because if anything, it doesn't. He doesn't. It sort of toes the line, just like Lawrence Schiller's Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. And that's understandable, because if he didn't, he, but more importantly his publisher, would likely get sued. So why have I used Follain's narrative as source material? I mean, I've written 2 trilogies on this case. That's 6 books. So why am I instead of dipping into my narratives, why am I instead showing off his book in photos like this? Well, the shorter answer is that I do find Follain incredibly useful in terms of what I've just read to you, his direct observations firsthand in the courtroom. I wish I could have been there, but I wasn't, and the next best thing is him being there and him sharing his observations. Are they credible? Are they likely? Are they useful? And all of this was going on during the trial, and a lot of this sort of observation went unreported by the journalists in the news media. They may have seen it, they may have observed it, they may have witnessed it, but is there place for this sort of detail in a news article that's really just about summarizing the facts of a particular court day? Are you going to go into this kind of detail? And the answer is no. And that is why a book can be so valuable, because that does go into that kind of detail. Now, Knox apparently mouthing what a pain in the arse Robin is, and we don't know for sure that that is what she was doing. But what we do know is it seemed to solicit a conspiratorial snigger or grin inside a fucking courtroom while on trial for murder. She's on trial for murder, he's on trial for murder. And that already tells you a lot about the level of maturity or immaturity we are dealing with here. And this is really the third aspect that I really wanted to highlight: immaturity. If what we are talking about is what is accurate, is this response, is this reaction, this behavior in in interacting with what Robin is saying about her and about what these British girls are feeling about her, is that an immature response in the context of inside a courtroom? Is it immature inside the context of a classroom? And so, the point isn't so much whether you or I or even Follain, for that matter, found Knox's conduct inside the court during her murder trial, or at the police station, or in the cottage while she was still living with Meredith, immature or not. So whether you think it's immature, whether I think it's immature, whether the author thinks it's immature, doesn't really matter. What matters is what Meredith thought. And what do you think she did think? What is Robin saying she did think? What is Robin saying she thought about her behavior? Well, she's saying it quite plainly. And so the bottom line here is whether Meredith's 7 friends, not just Robin, but the other 7 friends as well, what they felt. And did they all feel the same way? Were there 8 youngsters all feeling the same way, which amounts to a kind of antagonism against Knox? And if that was the case, didn't Knox feel the same thing, antagonism towards them and Meredith? And I think there's no doubt about the answer to that, don't you? Before we get to the rest of this analysis, and if you haven't listened to any of the Knox coverage, I really recommend that you listen to this one to the end. So if there's something distracting you, if there's something you need to do, maybe you need to do that. Otherwise, make a little bit of time available so you can listen to this to its completion. I do think this is one of the strongest analyses I've done, having gone to Italy. But before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Also, have a look at these shoes that I wore while I was in Italy. If you want to contribute to a new pair, this is your chance. So this is your chance to hit the thanks button and buy me a new pair of shoes. I'd really appreciate that. Please also leave a comment, particularly regarding the points made in this video. I'd love to hear what you think whether what you agree with, what you don't, and perhaps other points that I didn't get around to dealing with. And let's get started. Now, for all Knox's assurances that there was no enmity between herself and Meredith, well, let me ask you, don't you get the idea that Knox has repeatedly said that there was no problem with Meredith, that they weren't bosom buddies, but they were friends, right? And yet you don't really get a sense from Knox showing any emotion that was the case, whereas all of Meredith's friends were showing emotion. But even beyond that, even 5 years later, 10 years later, do you really ever hear Amanda Knox saying, I want to campaign for Meredith, I want to make a tribute to Meredith, I want us to remember Meredith? Is it about remembering Meredith, or is it about Amanda Knox remembering herself and establishing herself in the public mindset? Because it's really through Meredith's friends after the fact that we observe something else. And as you're about to see, it's also not a once-off flash-in-the-pan scenario. It repeats itself in a pattern. It reinforces this impression of holding a grudge and holding, this is important, holding one another in contempt.
Contempt.
Now, contempt is a very effective word to describe what we're talking about here, but in the end, it's just a word. What does contempt feel like? Well, it is the feeling that a person or a thing is worthless or beneath consideration. Have you ever experienced that? It is scorn, disdain, disrespect, deprecation, disparagement, denigration, all of those things, right? It is ridicule, mockery, derision, loathing, detestation, abhorrence, basically hatred, right? Disgust, loathing. And the opposite of all of that is respect. And so what do you think is going on in that courtroom when Robin is testifying? How do you think Amanda Knox is reacting to that? And again, we might be misinterpreting it. Follain might be misinterpreting it. But it seems as though there's contempt, shared contempt from Solicitor and Amanda Knox, but also that there seems to be contempt from Meredith's side and Robin's side, and then also her other friends, right? So there seems to be mutual contempt, right? And what does that feel like? And I can tell you, while I was in Europe, something happened that made me feel worthless and disrespected while I was away. Someone did something at my home that made me feel just like that. And I'm still incredibly angry about it. I'm pissed off about it because it feels like contempt towards me. And it's really not a nice feeling. Contempt is often deliberate as well. When someone holds someone else in contempt, they want to show that they disrespect you. And isn't that exactly what was done in the courtroom? That it was shown, it was seen, it was observed, wasn't it? Now again, this can often be bad enough when it's one individual's contempt, but what if it's more than one? What if it's 2 or 3 or 5 or 7 or 8? And so it's easy to see how all 7 of Meredith's friends were scornful and contemptuous of Knox. Robin Butterworth, Amy Frost, Sophie Purton, Natalie Hayworth, Jade Bidwell, Samantha Rodenhurst, and Helen Powell. But what we tend to forget is that Knox was scornful and resentful of them as well. Have you ever heard Knox mentioning any of their names? Identifying any of them? Because they were Meredith's friends. And not only that, wasn't Solicitor as well in solidarity holding Knox's grudge as well? And so you almost had 2 little groups. You had the Meredith group with her friends, which was 8 individuals. And then you had Knox, and who was part of that group? Was it only one other person, or was it perhaps more than one other person? But there's also another observation Follain highlights from ground zero, from right outside the scene of the crime, and it's made by Meredith's friends, and it lasers in on an incredibly vital point. Listen to this. Before flying off to Perugia, Sophie had talked to Amy and Robin, these are 3 of Meredith's friends, about what lay ahead. And this is a reference to what lay ahead in terms of the court, the trial, what to expect, what it was going to be like. Amy and Robin were more certain of Amanda's guilt than Sophie was. And so it's not like all of them just immediately thought Amanda's guilty. One of them was less sure about it. And the three of them then dissected what they saw of Amanda's behavior after the murder again and again. They shared what they knew, and they tried to understand what they'd seen. And they compared what the one had seen to what the other one hadn't seen. And all of them had been struck by what Amanda had chosen to wear. This is so important. What Amanda had chosen to wear on the morning after the murder. Her appearance on the morning after the murder. A white skirt, a blue sweater, and thick grey socks which went up to her knees. Do you find anything peculiar with that? The three friends all thought the socks and the skirt were a strange combination. Why hadn't she just put some jeans on? Robin guessed that she'd chosen the long, thick socks to cover up scratch marks. Now, I actually have a very different interpretation. For me, the socks and skirt is weird for another reason. It's cold, so why doesn't Knox have any clean clothes, decent, warm clothes to wear following Meredith's murder? And shortly after the murder, Knox actually had to go and buy clothing as well. And scratch marks is another area that's very underemphasized in this case. If you do want to go into that area, it is another area that's very underemphasized. Even the prosecutor, McNeely, noticed a fresh wound on Knox's neck. I think someone else who noticed it was Philomena. It's either Philomena or Laura, one of them, also noticed it. And so on page 139, Follain writes, as he talked, McNeely noticed a red mark in the middle of her throat, that's Knox's throat, but thought nothing of it. Now, I must say, this blows my mind, that you actually have the prosecutor noticing something, but then just failing to appreciate what it was, failing to even bring it up in conversation with Knox. And so I want to come back to Meredith's friends and their testimony in court, more particularly to focus on Amanda's reaction to their testimonies in court. For me, the importance here isn't the actual testimony. It is actually seeing Knox reveal the dynamic that was actually taking place in a public setting where you have independent people who are outside of that dynamic, reporters, seeing all of this take place inside the courtroom. And I mean, what better place or way is there to measure appropriateness and maturity than in this setting? I've been in a courtroom, and it is all about decorum. There's certain things you shouldn't do. There's certain things you see people doing that some people wouldn't agree with, like chewing gum, and certain clothing that people would wear or not wear. In any event, we've touched on two major driving forces in this case, drugs and sex. And I think they are interlinked. Sex is an impact on drugs. Drugs is an impact on sex. But in this analysis, we finalize our analysis with the third in this trifecta of these forces, and one that I think is vastly underestimated, which is immaturity. And how does immaturity impact something like drug use? How does immaturity impact something like sex? And how do the three of those combine to form a deadly cocktail? Now, you may remember we've spoken a little bit about Robin talking about Amanda's bathroom kit that had a vibrator inside of it. And this actually prompted Knox to stand up in court. And this was reported in the media at the time, that she stood up and she spoke for herself, kind of in defense of herself. She felt like what Robin had said she needed to counter there and then. And so Follain writes, her voice was deep, clear, and firm. That's Amanda Knox's voice, standing up in court. As she spoke in fluent Italian, gazing steadily at Judge Massey. Ah, Amanda Knox, good morning, Senior Judge. I wanted to give a very brief explanation about the question of the beauty case, which should still be in the bathroom at my house. I don't know. Then she continued, this vibrator does exist. It's a joke. It's a present a girlfriend gave me before I came to Italy. It's a small pink rabbit about this size. She made a gesture to indicate it was about 4 inches long. Excuse me if, well, so that's it. I also wanted to say I'm innocent and that I'm confident that everything will come out. Everything will sort itself out. Thank you. Okay. And so Follain adds that Amanda said okay in a chirpy tone that sounded out of place in the courtroom. Amanda smiled as she finished, then sat down. And so Follain is just making his own observation. He's saying, well, regardless of really what Amanda is saying here, the tone in which she's saying it seems to be chirpy, maybe one could argue even cheeky, but it's a rebuttal there and then to Robin. In other words, she's basically taking Robin down in court, saying she doesn't know what she's talking about, or this is really what you need to know, right? And so Amanda smiled as she finished, then sat down with her head bowed, blowing air out through puffed cheeks, apparently to release tension. And this is what I mean by fantastic observation. Again, you might say, I don't know if he observed it accurately, but if he did, what if it's true? What if Amanda Knox was feeling tense, agitated, rising feelings of opprobrium in her body, and she then is triggered or provoked or whatever, moved to stand up and counter Meredith's friend saying something which, quite frankly, she probably felt humiliated her, and she was trying to say, this is no big deal. And then she sits down and blows out like that. And doesn't that tell you something when Follain says, apparently that was to release tension? Isn't that telling you that there was tension? Isn't that acknowledging that there are feelings of tension on public display right here? And also what you have to recognize is that Knox treats the inside of the courtroom, and this is my opinion, this is just what it seems like to me, because I've been in court and you don't often see a defendant stand up in the middle of testimony and say, I want to make this statement. Of course, this is an Italian courtroom and protocols are slightly different, but it kind of feels like the courtroom is like a high school classroom and the judge is just a teacher. And I want to make sure that I set the record straight. But it's not a lesson being taught. It's a murder trial that's being held, being heard. You also have to look at the aspect that Knox defends. She stands up to defend something. What is so important? Is she defending blood evidence? Is she standing up to be clear about some forensic examination that could implicate her, but it's actually, there's some issue with it or some misunderstanding with it? But instead, she's rationalizing or justifying something that has to do with her personally and how other females her age, maybe slightly older than her, have reacted to it. That is what she feels so strongly about. And so in a strictly legal sense, what this whole thing has about whether it's a vibrator or not, does it have real evidentiary value or does it have dubious evidentiary value? But what value does it have? Well, I think it does reveal the true dynamic that's going on here, which is that there was very real tension. And you might say, this is really boring, I really don't see the point of it. But that's not what matters. It's not whether the dynamic resonates with you, it's whether it resonated with them. It's whether there was a difference of opinion on things that might not mean very much to you as whatever your age is. It's whether it resonated with them and was a big deal to them. And doesn't this standing up and addressing the court on this very issue elevate it to say this was something that they cared about because they're still arguing about it, right? And so think about it in terms of the status quo of a 20-year-old American trying to hold her own against an 8-strong group of disapproving British girls. They're adversaries, really. There's almost like a sexual competition going, but also kind of a popularity competition going. And whose side are you on? And you can see how important it is to Knox to stand up for herself. And a lot of Knox coming to Italy was about standing up, about becoming and about standing out. So you simply cannot hope to understand this case without taking on the psychology of a first-year university student, and an immature one at that. And in the same way that I think you need to look at this case to understand it through the psychology of university students, I think the John Benet Ramsey case, you need to think about it through child psychology. And this is also not to say that Knox didn't possess power and agency, and that is precisely the point. She did. She knew she did. She knew she had power to wield, and that she could wield that power. But would Meredith and her friends let her? And what if they wouldn't let her? Would she stand for that? And even if they didn't let her, would Knox let that stand in a way of becoming? You also can't hope to understand Knox only within the bubble of Perusia and the time scale of that bubble. You have to understand who she was before that, who she was becoming from whoever she was, and how far she'd come, and where she wanted to become at the end of that.
Like, I don't even know what my place is anymore. What's my role in society? Who am I after this? After everyone has branded me, who am I? People ask me questions like, well, what about your behavior outside of the house the morning that you were discovered? Like, don't you think that they were justified in suspecting you? And it's like, no, I don't. I really don't.
Now, that audio is from The Guardian from 2014, so 10 years ago. And what is interesting is 10 years ago, Amanda Knox still didn't really know who she was. And if you think about Amanda Knox today, 17 years later, she still seems to base herself. I mean, I think she calls herself an exoneree. A lot of what she thinks about, talks about, gives interviews about, is about innocence. She still seems to be gravitating to this incident, and it seems to define her. And while in this interview that she gave 10 years ago, she seems to resent it, she's been acquitted since then, and she's been free to carry on with her life. And what has she done instead? She has instead defined herself through this case. She's executive producing something to do with that incident, which she doesn't have to do.
And I think that was because a lot of people think of me not really as a human being, but as an idea of a person, as like a tabloid entity that they can sort of constantly refer back to without actually engaging with as a real human being.
And that is from the first minute or so of an interview Knox gave to the BBC. And what's so ironic about that is Knox received the same criticism about her coldness towards Meredith's friends, and just in the aftermath of Meredith's murder, that she didn't seem to acknowledge Meredith as a human being. And that's besides very seldom acknowledging Meredith as a person, as the true victim in this case. And while I think it's also important to remember Meredith's backstory, the same's true of Knox's backstory. And so in Follain's book, we find out some of it. That Amanda Knox had led what her stepfather Chris called a fairly regimental life. Same breakfast every day, school, homework, a break to watch The Simpsons, more homework than bed. The same every stinking day. Now, who would know that better than someone who actually lived with her, someone in her inner circle? And so why wouldn't someone want to break away from that in a very different environment? And I can tell you, Italy is the kind of environment that does provoke a response. It does make you feel like you're coming alive. The food is amazing. The people are very emotional. There's just a lot of passion and intensity in a lot of what goes on when you're in Italy. Now, what if you add to that taking drugs, having sex, but you're also immature? You're not sure what level of intensity and passion to pursue in your search for yourself. But the bottom line is that her own family described Knox leading a regimented life, and one mostly lived in books. So much so that when Knox went to Italy, she had the hots for a fictional character called Harry Potter. I think she was even reading Harry Potter at the time. I think one of the very last Harry Potter books she was reading, and then I think she even read another version of it in German. And she was so caught up in this fiction which is also kind of a sign of immaturity, to be 20 years old and reading fictional books and being very caught up in them, that it was apparently why she thought Raffaele was attractive, because he had glasses, because he resembled to her an Italian Harry Potter. Even the yellow and maroon scarf Raffaele wore at the crime scene is straight out of the Gryffindor merch store. I know because I've got one. I bought it at Universal Studios. Well, I see we at the 30-minute mark. I'm not going to take it further than that. If you found this analysis worthwhile, please let me know in the comments, and I'll see you guys next time.